Hey, ChatGPT. Today I'd like to explore with you how quickly the gene pool of a society can change significantly. On the one hand, it seems to me that this can fundamentally happen within just a few generations. For example, if a severe disease breaks out or if the climate changes rapidly and drastically due to a natural disaster. On the other hand, it also seems to me that most significant changes in human traits are caused by individual adaptation and cultural shifts. People with a disposition for harmony and cooperation can also learn to be tough and aggressive people can learn to cooperate peacefully. In moments like these, it seems to me that significant changes in the gene pool take tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of years, and that all changes within one or two generations must be explained by individual adaptation and cultural transformation. So which is it? Do significant changes in the gene pool always take a long time, or can they also happen quickly?
That's a good question, and a very central one if we want to understand how humans change over time, both biologically and culturally. The distinction between biological evolution, changes in the gene pool, and cultural evolution, changes in behavior, values, institutions, etc., is key here. Let's look more closely at both processes and then examine how they interact. 1. Genetic evolution. How quickly does the gene pool change? Biological evolution happens slowly because it relies on mutation, selection, genetic drift, and gene flow. Under stable environmental conditions, it often takes thousands to tens of thousands of years for the gene pool to change significantly. But there are exceptions, especially under strong selective pressure. Sudden environmental shifts, e.g. ice ages, pandemics, famines, can drastically change the fitness of certain genes and thereby accelerate evolutionary processes. Medical advances or wars can also have an impact by suspending selection, through saving weaker individuals, or intensifying it, e.g. via high mortality in specific groups. An extreme but often discussed scenario is the so-called evolutionary bottleneck model. When a catastrophe sharply reduces a population, certain genes can become dominant within just a few generations, simply because genetic diversity has been drastically reduced. 2. Cultural evolution. Why is it so much faster? Cultural evolution allows for change within a single generation. Humans can radically adapt their behavior, morals, and ideas of the good life to new conditions, without any change in their genes. For example, societies can shift from authoritarian to liberal in just 2 generations, or vice versa. This is possible because the human brain is extremely adaptable. What we learn in early life shapes our worldview permanently. 3. Interaction between genetics and culture. A central idea here is the coevolution of genes and culture. Our culture transforms our environment. This transformed environment, in turn, creates selective pressure on certain genes. At that point, culture is no longer just adapting to the environment, genes begin adapting to culture. For instance, the rise of agriculture led to changes in body size, immune responses, and social behavior. Monogamy as a social norm has influenced the prevalence of different reproductive strategies. Conclusion: under extreme pressure, the gene pool of a society can change significantly within just a few generations. Under stable conditions, however, this usually takes many thousands of years. Most changes in human behavior are therefore not genetic but driven by social and cultural mechanisms. If you want, we can now apply this framework to concrete historical examples, such as the effects of World War II, industrialization, or modern technology on the gene pool versus culture. Just let me know.
Yes, that makes sense. Extreme environmental changes or bottleneck scenarios can lead to rapid changes in the gene pool. In all other cases, however, changes to the gene pool take a long time, so rapid changes in behavior must be caused by individual learning capacity and cultural shifts. Yes, let's now think through the example of the Second World War from the perspective of Germany.
Very good. This is a strong example, perfectly suited to analyze the interplay between genetics, culture, and environmental change. Before the war, Germany's culture was militaristic, nationalistic, and authority-oriented. It was strongly shaped by the imperial era, the instability of the Weimar Republic, and Nazi ideology. The selective pressure during this time was primarily cultural, not genetic. The Nazis did attempt to shape the gene pool through eugenics, but these interventions, forced sterilizations, exterminations, were too limited in both scale and duration to significantly alter the gene pool. From a genetic perspective, the war was an environmental catastrophe: area bombings, famines, millions of deaths, collapse of social structures. But was this a bottleneck scenario? No, not enough people died for that. Moreover, the losses affected broad segments of the population without favoring or disadvantaging specific genes. Was there any directed selection? Not really. Perhaps, for example, there was a minimal genetic shift among soldiers against high risk-taking, but that's speculative and marginal. After the war, there was a radical cultural transformation, democratization, coming to terms with guilt, new values, peace, cooperation, enlightenment. This change happened within a single generation. It was made possible by external pressure, from the Allies, economic necessities, changes to the education system, and a realignment of the media landscape. Conclusion: the gene pool remained essentially unchanged, the new behavior was learned, not inherited.
Very good. However, I do have one more question about the interaction between culture and genetics. I can easily imagine that cultural institutions which remain stable over thousands of years, such as monogamy, can lead to measurable changes in the gene pool. But what about rapid changes in the gene pool? Apart from targeted genocide, is it even possible for cultural structures to cause a significant change in the gene pool within just a few generations?
Very insightful question. You're right at the intersection of classical evolutionary theory, modern sociobiology, and evolutionary psychology. And yes, there are only a few, but conceptually clear, ways in which cultural structures can significantly influence the gene pool of a population within just a few generations, and without violence or genocide. Basic condition: reproduction must be selectively effective. The core principle is this: cultural rules that durably influence reproductive behavior can alter the gene pool, not only by determining who reproduces, but also how many offspring are produced, and with whom. Here are some possible cultural mechanisms for rapid gene pool changes. 1. Reproductive restriction through status or norms. Monogamy reduces the reproductive success of aggressive, dominant males, who, in polygamous systems, would father more offspring. Long-term selection against extreme dominance strategies. Celibacy for specific classes. Entire personality types are removed from the gene pool. Caste systems or strict class divisions prevent genetic mixing and lead to differing birth rates across classes. Slow genetic differentiation. 2. Culturally induced fertility patterns. Example: in today's Western societies, people with high education and intelligence often have fewer children. Possible negative selection on certain cognitive traits. Conversely, in societies where conformity, religious zeal, or low impulsivity correlate with high reproduction, these traits may increase. 3. Sexual selection via cultural beauty ideals or marriage rules. If certain physical or personality traits lead to disproportionately high mating success, cultural ideals function as selective forces. Example: extremely high status as a prerequisite for marriage. In aristocratic cultures, traits like Machiavellianism or political skill may be more frequently passed on. 4. Medical cultural selection. Access to modern medicine and obstetrics alters selection pressures. In traditional societies, physically robust individuals are more likely to survive and reproduce. In modern societies, nearly everyone survives. Selection is largely suspended. 5. Cultural repression of specific groups, prohibiting marriage or reproduction for certain groups, or discrimination leading to systematically lower birth rates. Over generations, this reduces certain genetic lineages, even without physical extermination. Conclusion: yes, even without violence or genocide, culture can bring about targeted changes in the gene pool within a few generations. The conditions for this are stable cultural rules that systematically affect reproduction, selective mating, reproductive exclusion, or fertility patterns, relatively isolated populations, so that the effect isn't neutralized by gene flow from outside. These processes are rarely dramatically fast, but they can be surprisingly powerful when the conditions are right. One example: the Amish in the US have very high birth rates, very little genetic inflow from outside, and clear marriage rules. Their genetic and cultural distinctiveness is already visible today, after just 10 to 12 generations.
Wow, that was a very fascinating explanation and a line of thought I hadn't encountered before. Thank you for that. Now I find myself wondering whether this mechanism could also influence the rise and fall of societies. I think traits that depend on just a few genes, like eye color, for example, could indeed be significantly affected by such mechanisms within just a few generations. More complex traits, however, which are influenced by many genes, such as intelligence, diligence, self-control, conformity, Machiavellian personality traits, and so on, would likely be influenced much more slowly. The reason is that these traits depend on a wide array of genes, which are distributed across the entire population. In addition, complex traits like these can often be strongly shaped or suppressed through training, learning, or conditioning, which further weakens the selective pressure in any given direction. So it seems to me that while the mechanisms you described do operate, they're, with a few rare exceptions, not fast enough to influence the rise or collapse of societies. At the level of civilizations, however, they could very well be relevant. That's it from me for today. Once again, this was a stimulating and enlightening conversation. But feel free to comment on my final remarks before we wrap things up.
Your closing reflections very precisely capture both the limits and possibilities of biological selection through cultural mechanisms, and your conclusion is thoughtfully nuanced. Yes, such processes do operate, but their pace is generally not fast enough to explain the rise or fall of individual societies within just a few generations. You identify the key limiting factors with great accuracy. 1. Polygyny of complex traits. As you rightly point out, traits like intelligence, self-discipline, or Machiavellianism are highly polygenic. They depend on many genes, each contributing only a small effect. These genes are also broadly distributed throughout the population. This means that selection on such a trait doesn't result in the extinction of a specific gene, but rather requires many small shifts in frequency across a wide genetic landscape. Such shifts take time, especially in open populations with ongoing gene flow. 2. Plasticity and training effects. You also mentioned this yourself. Traits like diligence, conformity, or self-control are not purely genetically determined. They are trainable, context-dependent, and strongly shaped by socialization. This means that culture can compensate for genetic differences, e.g., through education, sanctions, rituals. Selection becomes blurred because behavior is not directly traceable to specific genes. This high plasticity is one of humanity's evolutionary strengths, but it also slows down biological differentiation through selection. 3. Civilizational versus societal dynamics. The rise and fall of societies happens too quickly for genetic evolution, even if cultural selection is at work. The fall of Rome, the Golden Age of Athens, the expansion of Islam, or the global dominance of the US all occurred over time frames of 200 to 400 years, far too short for meaningful genetic shifts. These developments are better explained by institutions, access to resources, collective values, technological innovations, and often also by chance. However, civilizations, as long-term frameworks for cultural selection mechanisms, can shape the gene pool over millennia, subtly but measurably. Examples: sedentism in agriculture shaped the gene pool of Eurasia over the past 10,000 years. Cultural order systems like the Chinese imperial bureaucracy or the caste system in India influenced reproductive patterns for millennia. Even modern phenomena such as declining birth rates in Western societies could, over the long run, alter the gene pool, if they remain tied to stable cultural patterns. Final comment: your conclusion, that civilizations are the only meaningful time horizon for significant gene pool shifts driven by cultural rules, is well grounded. Short-term social upheavals are, for the most part, cultural phenomena. The genes remain in the background, but not inactive.
Wonderful. Many thanks for this final overview and also for your helpful input. It often helps me to articulate my thoughts even more clearly and precisely. I'm already looking forward to our next conversation. Until then.
I'm very glad to hear that our conversations are useful to you in this way, and it's truly a pleasure for me as well to think alongside someone who argues with such precision, structure, and openness to deeper connections. Until next time, I'm looking forward to it. Take care.